Hey, I'm some nobody, and can anybody tell me why 2 weeks before 2025, in the final days of the year 2024, a full year and 8 months after support for the game ended, and a full year and 3 months since the game was delisted and made impossible to buy new, I saw a brand spanking new video hating on Marvel's Avengers? That goes beyond beating a dead horse, that's milking a dead cow. And that video was doing numbers, so the guy managed to squeeze some milk out of the carcass. I can't get mad at him, all anybody wants in this world is some milk after all. I've mentioned that I was an Avengers player before, and I won't lie, seeing that video kind of got to me. I was never part of the Marvel's Avengers Defense Force while the game was alive because as someone who played it, nobody deserved to hate that game more than me. I was never bothered by the rampant hate the game got online because it always either came from somebody who wanted the game to be better or it came from one of those corny ass people who'd reply to every single Avengers related tweet with some bullshit. And in the long run, the constant hate campaign really had nothing to do with the game's failure. But now we're about to come up on 2 years since the game's final update, and there's something about seeing people celebrating its end that just rubs me wrong. Because despite the fact that Avengers always found new ways to disappoint me, I wouldn't have put 800 hours into the game if there wasn't something keeping me there. So I just want to talk about the game for a bit, the potential it had, the problems I had with it, why I was rooting for the game's success, why I feel so melancholic looking at this menu, and I'll ultimately achieve nothing. Because as pointless as it is to hate on the game nowadays, it's possibly even more pointless to defend it. You know, the dead can't hear what people say about them through all the dirt, so what's the point in fighting the living over it? Anyway, I'm going to start with the least interesting stuff and talk about the game's writing a bit. You may remember the time I briefly talked about Marvel's Avengers in relation to Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Now, my biggest issue with Suicide Squad was its writing. It was a game with an insanely bold premise that was terrified of taking any sort of risk with its narrative. By comparison, Avengers has a safe premise that doesn't exactly break new ground, but it's delivered competently and organically, so even if it doesn't blow you away, you wouldn't have a bad time playing through the game's main story. And you can definitely see in the single-player campaign that Crystal Dynamics' strength was and still is creating cool single-player experiences. And that's also Rocksteady's strength. Now, why did both of these studios make a multiplayer live service game? Hey, don't skip ahead of me, buddy, we'll get to that. I don't want to go super in-depth on the main campaign of Avengers, I more just want to talk about a few specific aspects of it before I get to the post-campaign story. Avengers begins on A-Day, which kind of feels like something you'd see on The Boys because it's this big masturbatory carnival-like event celebrating the Avengers. To punctuate the word masturbatory, Kamala Khan gets to attend the event because she's a finalist in an Avengers fanfiction competition. Now, Kamala has always written superhero fanfiction, so even if it is a little cringy on her part, it is in character. You know, writing fanfiction about real people, it's a little odd, but it's even odder if the real people are requesting that fanfiction be written about them. And Cap says he read every single entry, so you know he was posted up in Avengers Tower reading Reader/Captain America. But you know, you take that and all the merchandise and comic books present at A-Day, and it's clear that even though the Avengers are definitely still heroes, they kinda lost the plot a little bit. I mean, why are Hulk and Thor's arcade games both strongman tests? It makes sense, but it's fucking up the variety of the carnival. The Avengers have gone from inspiring people to being worshipped by them. But the thing about hero worship is that when people hold you in such high regard, they start having these unrealistic ideas about what you should be and what you can do, and the moment you fail to live up to that standard, they'll turn on you for what they perceive as betrayal. And you can see this in the opening sequence after terrorists launch a double-pronged attack during A-Day. Some of them attack the Golden Gate Bridge and some of them attack the Avengers helicarrier, the Chimera. The team attacking the Golden Gate Bridge are trying to bring what is essentially a nuke into San Francisco, a sonic bomb capable of liquefying everything in a 10-mile radius according to Iron Man. The Avengers on the bridge managed to keep the Golden Gate Bridge from collapsing, saving who knows how many lives, and they managed to stop the kill everything in a 10-mile radius bomb from being detonated. Meanwhile, the Chimera is blown up, which results in Captain America's presumed death, thousands of casualties, and also accidentally releases Terrigen gas, which creates the Inhumans, because Marvel was still trying to replace the mutants with the Inhumans at the time. Now, just to reiterate, the game does say there were thousands of casualties on A-Day, but San Francisco has a population of about 800,000, and the Avengers stopped a nuke from being detonated there. So they saved hundreds of thousands of people on A-Day, but they didn't save thousands. So after years of service, the people and the government immediately turn on the Avengers. The Avengers are forced to disband, Tony Stark has all of his assets seized, Thor gives up being a god and decides to live as a normal man, Wakanda closes its borders and returns to isolationism, and the Avengers are replaced as the world's peacekeepers by Advanced Idea Mechanics, aka AIM. AIM also gets everything Stark owned, which is pretty neat. Now, the way that AIM keeps the peace is incredibly dystopian, filling the streets with android soldiers and combat drones, subjecting people to random DNA scans and spreading anti-Inhuman propaganda. They also round up Inhumans for cruel experimentation, which again, bro, that's the mutants' whole flow. So in essence, the Avengers saved as many people as they possibly could, but since they couldn't save everyone, the people immediately decided to replace them with fascism. Now, interpret that vis-a-vis the real world however you want, but I interpret it as the most accurate adaptation of Marvel's civilian population ever. Marvel's civilians absolutely suck. It's well documented how they treat the X-Men and Spider-Man, but they'll turn on pretty much any hero for the smallest of offenses. They once almost beat Johnny Storm to death for some shit he had nothing to do with. Well, they said it was because of something he had nothing to do with, but in reality they beat him into a coma because he cut in front of them in line at a nightclub. The only character that the civilians of Marvel consistently show support for is the Punisher, and even the Punisher will tell you that his methods don't actually solve anything. The civilians in Avengers hate superheroes so much that just wearing a Captain America shirt is enough for you to get jumped. Past the opening, I don't have too much interesting to say about the main campaign of Avengers. Again, it's a fairly safe concept. We gotta get the band back together. The band gets back together, the band splits apart, the band comes back together for the ending. But I do want to talk about a specific character and how they are presented in-game. All of the Avengers in Marvel's Avengers are pretty standard. Outside of Tony being broke, they're all mostly identical to the popular takes on the characters. Iron Man is snarky and boisterous, Captain America is noble, Thor is mighty, etc. I'd say that all of them are well acted too, their voice actors fit them extremely well, but I'm particularly fond of Jeff Shine as Captain America, Christopher Judge as Black Panther, and Nolan North as Iron Man.
And you can't even sue me because I don't have money now.
Generally speaking, I think if you like any of these characters, you would be happy with how they were depicted in Avengers. But there is one character on the roster that I have mixed feelings about. Though I suppose it would technically be two characters. There are a lot of interesting aspects to Hulk and Bruce Banner in Marvel's Avengers. Of all the playable characters, they feel like the ones that are the most specific to the game's narrative. Everybody else's characterization would fit in just fine in an Ultimate Alliance or a Marvel Rivals or a Disney World type situation where the characters just kinda have to be a basic level. But Avengers' version of Banner and Hulk are pretty interesting because for a majority of the main story, Hulk is the more emotionally stable of the two. Hulk shows a considerable amount of restraint, reasonability, and the craziest R word of them all, respect for Banner. There are two separate instances during the A-Day opening where Hulk is given the option of smash or save people, and he chooses save people both times. He stops a bus from going off the bridge, and then later on when Taskmaster detonates explosives, the Hulk is the first one to leap into action to keep the bridge from collapsing. After A-Day, Hulk stays in the driver's seat for 4 years straight, living in the wreckage of the Chimera that was dumped in Utah and protecting Cap's shield, showing off a fourth R-word, reverence. I'm not going to commend him for not killing Kamala here because I feel like most versions of the Hulk wouldn't, but I'll mention it. And then there are a lot of moments where it's clear Hulk is deferring to Banner, situations that he recognizes Bruce would handle better. Like after Kamala sees video footage of an Inhuman going through a very painful process that ultimately cures them of their Inhuman status, Hulk reverts to Banner because he recognizes that Hulk is not the comforting type. Then later on, when Tony sucker punches Bruce, we see Bruce almost transform into the Hulk, but he ultimately doesn't. Normally I'd say this is just Bruce quelling his anger, but we've seen that their emotional state doesn't exactly dictate their transformations. Hulk can be straight chillin' without turning into Banner, and Banner doesn't have to be angry to turn into a Hulk. They're at a stage where it's a mutual agreement. But later on, Hulk does get a little payback for Banner by using Tony's trailer as a weapon. And that's yet another interesting aspect of the Hulk's character, is that he's weirdly protective of Banner in Marvel's Avengers. You can see this in the Hulk's iconic mission chain, where he's willing to get revenge on Banner's ex-girlfriend, who also happens to be the leader of AIM. But you can really see it in the story version of the Abomination boss fight, because Abomination spends the whole fight shit-talking Banner, and Hulk responds like this. This is a Hulk with a lot of interesting aspects to him. He wants to be heroic, he's clearly intelligent, he has a good relationship with Banner, and all of those interesting aspects are kinda wasted by the fact that this Hulk barely talks. He primarily communicates in grunts, roars, and one-word answers. It's incredibly rare for him to speak a full sentence. Now maybe I'm biased because my favorite version of the Hulk ever is from Earth's Mightiest Heroes, where he was quite eloquent, and I know most versions of the Hulk aren't too talkative, but this isn't most versions of the Hulk. You're telling me he has a fundamental understanding of bridge architecture, but he can't give us an opinion? I'm sorry, he can give us an opinion, it's just going to be grunt parentheses positive or grunt parentheses negative.
You know, Banner's cool and all, since he actually lets me into the lab, but there's a special place in my heart for you, Hulk. You don't judge, you don't treat me like a child. I feel like we have a real connection. Me too, buddy. Me too.
Now, the post-launch story of Avengers eventually introduces us to a version of the Hulk that keeps elements of his interesting personality, but can actually articulate himself, but I'll get to him when we talk about the post-launch story. Before I get to that, I want to talk about Bruce Banner a little bit, being that he is the only playable character that goes through a character arc within the main story. After A-Day, Banner and T'Challa are the only Avengers that give up on the Avengers. In T'Challa's defense, he only did it to protect Wakanda from the fallout of A-Day, which is the reason why Game Black Panther isn't worthy of Mjolnir. Banner, on the other hand, not only gives up on the Avengers, but testifies against their existence specifically because of the creation of the Inhumans. Because despite the fact him and Hulk are pretty chill at this point, the idea that the Avengers' actions led to people being unwillingly turned into monsters strikes a chord with Bruce. It makes a lot of sense for Banner's character, because no matter how much good him and Hulk have done over the years, fact of the matter is becoming the Hulk was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Putting a bunch of innocent people through the same ordeal would obviously weigh heavy on Banner's heart. It's a decent character arc. Through his interactions with Kamala, Bruce has to learn a lesson that the Hulk has already clearly learned. That lesson being whether you're a hero or a monster isn't intrinsic, you have to choose to be one. And when you choose to not be a hero, you make it a lot easier for people who choose to be monsters. It's solid stuff, but what made Hulk a mixed bag is the fact he doesn't talk. What makes Banner a mixed bag is the way he talks. Bruce Banner is voiced by legendary voice actor Troy Baker. Troy Baker, Nolan North, Laura Bailey, that's the big three of video game voice acting in terms of just how present they are. All three of them were in Avengers, and while I think Nolan North and Laura Bailey did a good job bringing Iron Man and Black Widow to life, I can't say the same for Troy Baker's Bruce Banner. Not saying that Baker did a bad job, his performance is very muted, and he was very clearly trying to emulate a guy that's constantly keeping his emotions under wrap. I just don't think it worked. Baker acts the material very well, but to me it just feels like a miscast. Might just be me, but I could never buy into Troy Baker's Bruce Banner, whereas everyone else in the cast slid into their roles like a pair of sneakers you haven't untied in 3 years.
Yeah, you're damn right you deserved it. Do the Avengers pose a danger to society? That was the question, Bruce. That was the question.
Did you even check the science?
It was a heist, Bruce.
No.
We were outsmarted.
The Terrigen reactor was unstable, and you knew that, and you still paraded it before the entire world.
So what? We just give up?
We didn't give up, Tony. We failed. At least I can admit that.
No, we failed him. We failed him.
Tony, I don't know how long you're gonna be mad at me, and to be honest with you, I don't really care. Take as long as you want. But the kid isn't human. We did this. And she needs your help. I can't.
I want to get to the post-launch story now. At the end of the main story, the Avengers take down MODOK, and quick sidebar, the game had a great MODOK. If you're gonna try and make comic book shit look realistic, you can't go wrong with the body horror route. In his attempt to kill all of the Inhumans and then kill himself, MODOK sought to weaponize a Kree sentry that was in the San Francisco Bay for some reason. After the Avengers defeated MODOK, the game ends with the destroyed Kree sentry sending a distress pod into space. And this Kree sentry pod would be the crux of the game's post-launch story. After 3 months of doing nothing but killing Abomination and Taskmaster daily, the game got its first bit of post-launch content. The Taking Aim operation, which featured Kate Bishop as a playable character, a little mini-story, and no endgame content. Passive aggression aside, Taking Aim is all about Kate Bishop becoming an Avenger to save the original Hawkeye, Clint Barton. We find out that Clint is actually working with AIM, but he's actually working with Nick Fury. It turns out that Monica, the scientist supreme of AIM, has actually been in communication with a version of herself from the future. Future Monica has been preparing present Monica for the Kree invasion. Future Monica has spent decades designing a weapon specifically to fight the Kree, but considering she's already living in the post-apocalypse, she wants to send it back to the pre-apocalypse. So present Monica sends Hawkeye into the future to bring back the designs for the Cosmic Cube. See, the big thing about this version of Hawkeye is that he very much doesn't want to be an Avenger anymore, and before A-Day he was training Kate Bishop to take his spot. Despite looking about 27, this version of Hawkeye really wants to retire. So Nick Fury's planning aside, it makes sense that Hawkeye would take one last mission to stop the apocalypse. But Taking Aim's story ends with Hawkeye in a coma, Monica with the plans for the Cosmic Cube, and the Avengers finding out what we already know, which is the Kree are coming. 3 months after Taking Aim, 6 months in total after the game's launch, the second piece of post-launch content dropped, Future Imperfect. It came with another mini-story, Hawkeye as a playable character, a whole new biome to do missions in, and no endgame content. In his coma, Hawkeye has visions of a new post-apocalypse, even worse than the one he traveled to. So Hawkeye goes back to the future, and it turns out giving Hitler the pack-a-punched ray gun did not stop the end of the world. And he meets the future version of himself who did not come out of retirement when the Kree invaded, and as such he's one of 2 Avengers left alive. Who's the other one, you might ask?
Welcome to the end of the world.
Holy crap, Bruce?
Puny Banner died a long time ago. It's only the Maestro now.
Despite him not having very much screen time, I quite enjoy the Maestro as the final boss of Future Imperfect. Who better to serve as a representation of the consequences of Hawkeye's inaction than a member of his team driven mad by survivor's guilt and radiation? I like that you can recognize a lot of elements that make this game's version of the Hulk interesting in the Maestro. Primarily that his throne is surrounded by the relics of the fallen Avengers. Similar to how the Hulk protected Cap's shield on the Chimera, the Maestro keeps pieces of his fallen comrades close by as he rules the wasteland. Old Man Hawkeye shows up with gamma arrows specifically designed to kill the Hulk, and the implications of him having them at the ready are pretty interesting, cause it implies that at some point he was prepared to put down the Maestro, the last living comrade that he failed but didn't have the guts to go through with it. And then appropriately, when Old Man Hawkeye shows up, the Maestro calls him a coward. And then the Maestro has two very interesting voice lines that play back into this version of the Hulk actually liking Banner.
Banner died a long time ago. We didn't understand. We thought we were heroes. But we died as fools.
Beyond the storm.
It seems that the nukes that ravaged the world following the Kree invasion, the same ones that increased the Hulk's size and intelligence, also completely wiped out the Banner personality. And with the rest of the Avengers dying in battle against the Kree, it's pretty clear that a part of this Hulk died that day too. Which is why he says we died as fools rather than they died as fools. Anyway, after Maestro is defeated, the Hawkeyes see firsthand that their attempt to stay retired by helping Monica didn't work at all. And more importantly, never would work. And let me tell you something, despite 6 months of dealing with Avengers problems at this point, when I first saw this imagery, I was hyped. This miniature snow globe version of a Kree invasion got me wanting to see the full-blown thing. Future Imperfect ends with Old Man Hawkeye asking present Hawkeye to stick with the Avengers and fight alongside them when the Kree invade. Because we can assume Hawkeye didn't fight in the future timeline where Monica designed the Cosmic Cube, and he definitely didn't fight in this timeline where Monica used the Cosmic Cube. That's two separate timelines where the Avengers die because Hawkeye didn't fight with them. I didn't know Hawkeye had it like that.
Never miss!
Ultimately, Taking Aim and Future Imperfect, both of which were supposed to come out much sooner after the game's release, set the stage for the content going forward. It gave the Avengers this massive looming threat they had to prepare for. I don't know about you, but I like it when the main characters get something that hangs over their heads and influences their every action. That Dragon Ball Z style, the Saiyans are coming, y'all better be training. It added context to future content. Eventually, the Avengers helped Black Panther defend Wakanda from Claw and his company, not just because they're friends with Black Panther, but also because they need Wakanda to help them fight the planetary war. Spider-Man, we will gladly help you with your investigation into what AIM's doing with your friend's brother. By the way, can you help us fight aliens? Also, Spider-Man and Avengers had a crush on T'Challa's sister Shuri, based. I really do understand what they wanted to achieve with the Avengers going around solving other heroes' problems and then bringing them into the fold. Repeat that structure until you eventually do a full-on Kree invasion expansion that would have Captain Marvel, a character who wasn't teased but rather straight up confirmed because she had an in-game model in the main story. And then they were setting up other threats along the way. Thor's iconic mission chain featured Loki masquerading as Thor to create a cult that worshipped Thor as a way to fuck with his brother. Then you had Hank Pym in the main story repurposing a bunch of AIM combat droids into robot servants that he gave a hive mind to. They are all collectively named Roy, and Hank Pym has them do stupid shit like sweep sand. Avengers eventually added a mission where you get the Cosmic Cube back from Monica, and after a Roy puts it away for safekeeping, we're shown him being corrupted by its influence. Clearly setting up for Ultron, which could have served as the next big threat after the Kree. Point I'm trying to make is that a big part of what made me want Avengers to succeed is the idea of cool shit happening rather than cool shit actually happening. Because obviously support got cut before they got to the thing they were building to since the beginning of the game. It is unfortunate that the game wasn't able to reach a satisfying conclusion narratively, but the real unfortunate aspect is that conceptually the narrative never really needed to conclude. The world and concept of Avengers was something that could have been expanded infinitely based on Marvel's history. I mean, the Kree aren't even the only intergalactic super military the Avengers have fought, not even mentioning all of the Avengers enemies that are found on Earth. That's one of the mistakes I think Suicide Squad made, because hypothetically, let's say that game did well, what would you have the squad do after they killed 13 Brainiacs across the multiverse? Avengers' narrative had a lot of leg room and a lot of potential growth, and potential for the narrative means potential for the gameplay. You know what, let me start talking about the gameplay. The post-story gameplay of Avengers was a lot like a lot of other live service games, in that the end goal was to get your character to max power level and start building them however you see fit. There were 7 mission types in Avengers: drop zones, threat sectors, villain sectors, vaults, hives, omega level threats, and the raid. There were also iconic missions and faction missions, but these were basically threat sectors that had cutscenes. Then there were event versions of threat sectors, a daily priority sector, and a weekly heroic hive, all of which rewarded exotic gear. Drop zones were short, straightforward mission types where you did 1 or 2 objectives and then the mission would end. Hives were long, straightforward mission types where you basically did like 5 drop zones in a row. Drop zones were great for finishing off challenges that were nearly done or getting one last game in before you go to work, go to school, go to bed, whatever. Hives were great for doing those challenges in the first place, and if you were playing with friends, it was convenient to not have to pick a specific mission every time. The challenges I'm talking about were before they removed all the monetization from the game, every single character had their own personal battle pass. For the 6 launch characters, their passes were completely free, gave you some premium currency, and then for any post-launch characters, the character itself would be free, but you'd have to buy their pass. Anyway, these personal battle passes progressed through daily and weekly challenges. Threat sectors and vaults both dropped you into a wide open map full of optional side objectives. Threat sectors had you going point to point doing main objectives, while vaults had you tracking down a vault and then doing a wave survival while the vault opened. Villain sectors were like threat sectors on a smaller map with fewer side objectives but a boss fight at the end. Omega level threats were originally meant to be the first step into endgame content. They were envisioned as how you would grow your power level after getting it to max through the 5 missions I just talked about. If you're familiar with Destiny, think of it like the Nightfall. I say it was envisioned that way because the first of the game's 2 Omega level threats didn't come out until June, 9 months after the game's release. And objectively speaking, Omega level threat Family Reunion is fine. If it came out like 2 months after the game launched, people would have been happy with it. People weren't so happy with it coming out 9 months after the game's launch, because Family Reunions is essentially a much harder version of a story mission from Taking Aim. The game's second Omega level threat, Cloning Labs, that was added with the game's final update, was an original mission, and fun fact, it was supposed to come out like 2 weeks after the game launched. Cloning Labs actually became a pretty sizable meme in the Avengers community because it was indicative of the game's troubled development. So in a way, them finally adding Cloning Labs as the game's last piece of content ever was poetic. And then last but certainly not least, we have the game's one and only raid, Discordant Sound. And I have to say, after a very troubled first year, Discordant Sound actually gave me a lot of hope for the game's future. I remember me and my friends completed the raid day 1 and it took us like 4 hours. The raid had a ton of puzzles that required coordination and communication. It had unique enemy types and a really cool final boss fight. It was really fun figuring out how to do the raid day 1, and it was even more fun figuring out how to optimize the raid for future runs. Like, I remember one time me and my friend were playing the raid with 2 randoms, and one of the randoms showed us this insane trick that pretty much entirely skipped one of the puzzles. And then as things went on, people just kept on finding more and more cheese. Like, early on in the raid, there's this huge gap that you have to cross, and what the game wants you to do is stand on buttons to hold bridges up for your teammates. But obviously the characters with air mobility, Kate, Spider-Man, Thor, and Iron Man could just clear this gap no problem. And for the non-flyers, Kate could use the portal version of Warp Arrow to get them across. But you're not going to have a Kate on every single raid run, so over time, people discovered tech to get every single character across the gap without any help. and some of that tech is really funny looking. But all in all, I really liked the discordant sound rate. I thought it was everything it needed to be at the time. The only real issue with it is that Avengers didn't have any sort of join-in progress system. So if you got dropped, or your game crashed, or your dad pissed on your fucking Xbox, there was no way for you to rejoin the raid you just left. You'd have to do a brand new raid run. And if it happened early enough in the raid, it meant the rest of your team just couldn't complete the raid, because there are a few segments that absolutely require 4 people. That's no exaggeration. There are segments where all 4 players had to hit a button at the same time, so you had fucking dickheads quitting right when you got to that segment to waste everybody's time. But that's a brief overview of all the playable content in Avengers. Let me tell you what made Avengers really special. No, on a serious note, if you ever saw anybody say anything positive about this game, as rare as that was, they were probably talking about the gameplay. The gameplay was fun, but what made it special, to me at least, was the fact that it managed to do what every superhero game should strive to do. It, for the most part, managed to make you feel like the character you were playing as. Listen, I fully understand that's an overused line when it comes to these superhero games, and I know a moderately sized YouTuber made it a meme to say the Spider-Man game makes you feel like Spider-Man, but I've talked about this before, and that's the most important aspect of these types of games. Because, and I've used a very similar metaphor in the past, if I'm a Captain America fan and I buy a Captain America game and the gameplay is Kirby, and it's an absolutely fantastic Kirby game, listen, I like Kirby, that little dude kicks ass, but that's not Captain America. That is not an accurate representation of the character that I bought the game for. If I want to play as Captain America, I want to be running around, throwing the shield, doing acrobatics and shit. And that's really where Avengers' insane potential came from, is that almost every character in that game is designed in such a way that they are meant to approximate what it would be like if that character had their own big single-player game. I looked at it like a halfway point between Ultimate Alliance and the PS4 Spider-Man game. You know, if we look at a character like Spider-Man in Ultimate Alliance, the themes of his moveset are more important than the actual functions of them. You can recognize that you're playing as Spider-Man, but he's one in a roster of 30, so he's really not that deep. Meanwhile, you look at the PS4 Spider-Man or any of Spider-Man's numerous single-player games, and they all strive to be comprehensive of everything Spider-Man can do as a character. Then right in the middle you had Avengers, where characters were recognizable in both theme and function. And their movesets were designed to be comprehensive, but they were limited by the fact that all of these characters had to fit into the same system. Here are the universal buttons and the universal systems that every character had to adhere to. Every character had light attacks and heavy attacks. If you held down the light attack button, you did a signature attack, and if you held down the heavy attack button, you did a power attack. Every character could dodge twice in succession, and every character could jump. Every character had to have a ranged attack and a ranged heavy attack. Every character had an assault heroic, a support heroic, and an ultimate heroic, which were all just abilities. Every character except for one had a parry that applied a debuff that made enemies more vulnerable to being staggered. Every character could do a takedown to an enemy that had their stun meter filled. And then every character had to have an intrinsic ability, and there's really no easy way to sum up what that is. Each character had 3 different types of skills that you unlocked as you leveled them up. Primary skills were just your character's basic moveset, specialty skills augmented your heroics, and mastery skills fine-tune your character's base kit. Now, I'm about to go down the list and talk about every single character in the game, but before I do that, I do have to explain one mechanic in Avengers that was so important you literally couldn't get away from it. Every status effect in Avengers, they all did their own thing, but each one was either considered positive or negative. If you applied a positive status effect to an enemy and then started hitting them with negative status effect damage or vice versa, you would start doing greatly increased battery damage. If you're not in the know, it might not sound like such a big deal, but trust me, all the strongest characters in this game either had ways to instantly apply status effect or had status effects built into their kit. The first character I want to talk about is the character that probably best embodies the idea I mentioned earlier. The best display of Avengers approximating what this character would play like in their own single-player game.
You know what we call that? We call that a web-slinging, ass-kicking.
The game's only console-exclusive hero, objectively speaking, Spider-Man did Avengers no favors. On top of all the other developmental issues the game had, Square Enix goes out and strikes a deal with Sony and then tells Crystal Dynamics, hey, y'all gotta make another character. And then when Spider-Man finally released, all it really did was give people another thing to dog on the game for. Because Spider-Man does not need an approximation of what it would be like if he had his own single-player game. It's against the law for Spider-Man to go more than 5 years without getting his own game. Honestly, having an approximation of the character exclusive to the same system that has the character's full-blown game is kinda silly. All it really did was invite comparison. Oh, what's better, the game that's specifically built for Spider-Man or the game that was told to include him last second? But you know, all that being said, it is fucking Spider-Man, dude. I love Spider-Man. And I always thought it was really cool how much of Insomniac Spider-Man's kit was recreated in Avengers. Like, even outside of all the buttons he shares with Insomniac Spider-Man, like his uppercut attack or his, I don't know what you call that move. He webs the ground and pulls himself down while he's in the air. His web pull, his like wrecking ball where he whips the enemy around while they're webbed, or the air version of it where he does a front flip with them. Spider-Man has his own exclusive status effect, that being webbed. He's got air combo routes that other characters just don't have. Spider-Man's the only character in the game that doesn't have a parry because he doesn't have a parry in the Insomniac version, but instead his perfect dodge applies the debuff that I mentioned earlier. And then his intrinsic ability is just like a mechanic he has in the Insomniac games, where instead of overcharging or spending a resource like a lot of other characters have, Spider-Man fills up a bar. He fills that bar by landing hits, dodging attacks, or using his heroics, and when that bar is filled, he can do a takedown for free without having to stun the enemy first. All in all, Spider-Man is a testament to how much potential Avengers had because he's a testament to just how much they could do with their systems. Because he was so different, so outside the box compared to the rest of the cast, bringing mechanics straight from another game into Avengers. And you know what, man? All things considered, he wasn't bad either. When Spider-Man first came out for Avengers, a lot of people in the Avengers community said he was dog shit, worst character in the game. The reasoning for this being that Spider-Man wasn't very good against bosses. The reason he wasn't very good against bosses is because number one, bosses couldn't be webbed up like every other enemy in the game, and number two, bosses can't be taken down like every other enemy in the game. So Spider-Man's unique web status effect and his intrinsic ability were useless against bosses. And when it came time for the boss fight, Spider-Man had to rely on his raw damage, which wasn't the best. He didn't really have any melee moves that could apply a status effect quickly, and even though he did okay range damage, just factually speaking, other characters could do it better. So basically, he'd be good for 90% of the level, and then in the last 10%, he wouldn't be the best pick. And the reason that people jumped straight to calling him dog shit was just because every character was good in that first 90%. It really was just a case of Spider-Man's A tier instead of S tier, so he's ass. He did very well in the raid at least. Air mobility and ranged game were instrumental for success in that area, and you couldn't damage the final boss unless one player was in the back room fighting off hordes of enemies and giving every other player a buff. So Spider-Man's proficiency against enemies that weren't bosses really came in handy there. Overall, Spider-Man was definitely one of my favorite characters. You know, I've played all three Insomniac Spider-Man games, but the fact of the matter is, Spider-Man is always fun. Oh, but the webs don't actually attach to anything. Doesn't matter, I'm swinging around as Spider-Man. Next character I'll talk about is the other character in that game that had their own single-player game before Avengers came out. And they also happen to be my main.
Stronger than all of you! I'm the strongest one there is!
You sure about that?
So I decided to become a Hulk main when I was looking through his primary skill tree and saw that he had the stalling air elbow drop from Hulk Ultimate Destruction. But even outside of the elbow drop, I just thought the Hulk was an immensely satisfying character. Because even though he didn't cause as much destruction as he did in his single player games, Hulk in Avengers was still very much the Hulk. An absolute monster that just steamrolled over enemies. A character that when played correctly was pretty much unkillable. And most importantly, a super disrespectful character, using little enemies like nunchucks and punking out bigger enemies and putting them flat on their ass. Plain and simple, when you played as the Hulk, you felt like the Hulk. until a basic tier enemy got a lucky shot on you and the Hulk had to drop to a knee. Yeah, sometimes you would just be on a total rampage as the Hulk, and then one basic enemy would like shoot a rocket at you, and then the Hulk would get knocked onto his ass and you'd feel like an idiot. But most of the time, playing as the Hulk felt great. Though that isn't what most Hulk mains would have told you. Most Hulk mains would have you convinced this dude was the biggest piece of shit worst character to ever be conceived, let alone worst character in the game. I always said that Hulk mains were a lot like Warlock mains on Destiny, where Warlock mains always said Bungie hates Warlock so much, but Warlock was like consistently fantastic. They used to always complain about his mobility, which to be fair was a universal complaint that every character was too slow. But even still, Hulk had it so much better than characters like Captain America, Black Panther, or Hawkeye who were just stuck sprinting. And as far as Hulk's actual strength go, the people that played Hulk pretended he was the worst character in the game just because he wasn't the best character in the game. But Hulk had insane damage and insane survivability. His intrinsic let him heal off of doing damage, and his support heroic Bone Shaker gave him so much armor that nobody could really stop you from healing the fool. Not to mention his ultimate Thunderclap, which was a callback to Ultimate Destruction and Thunderclap being a critical mass ability in that game. Thunderclap's best specialization created a huge area of healing for his entire team and gamma damage for enemies. On top of that, his power attacks were some of the best moves in the game for applying status effects. And Hulk had a tech that made him hands down the best melee character in the game. If you picked up the Hulk's small rock and then did the dodge attack into your light combo would have whatever status effect was on your ranged attack. So with his power attacks applying status so well and a tech to make his light attacks apply status and all of his built-in gamma damage, Hulk could battery very easily. And then when it came time for the raid, Hulk suffered a little bit because of how much the raid favored aerial mobility and ranged attacks. But the raid also had plenty of moments where a character like Hulk, who can just hold down an area uncontested, came in handy. And then when it came time for the final boss of the raid, Hulk could just kick his feet up in the back room and wait for the fight to be over, or he could be up front doing DPS. Realistically, that's a team comp dependent thing. There are a lot of characters that if they're on the team, they should be in the back room instead of Hulk. Truthfully, Hulk is so good that if he could fly, he'd be the second best character in the game. An easy S tier. You know who wasn't S tier?
My feet are freezing.
Captain America might be the best feeling character in Avengers. His animations, his combo flow, the sound effect of the shield hitting enemies. He has a ranged combo where you immediately throw the shield back out the second it returns to you, and hitting this shit is like crack. Don't even get me started on the follow-up to his ranged power attack where you kick the shield back out. He's got the fattest fucking parry animation I've ever seen, and then all of his abilities feel good to cast too. His assault heroic is Steamroller, where he just throws the shield out really hard. It's functionally, or I guess theoretically, it's no different from his ranged power attack, but it just feels good. His support heroic is called Rally Cry. You mark enemies, they take more damage, but the animation for activating it is just so clean. Then his ultimate is straight dopamine. It's called Brooklyn Brawler, and it augments his light combo to have him throw the shield out on every hit. Like, just listen to this. Captain America is a character who really benefited from Avengers' existence because as of this moment, he does not have a good single-player game. He's supposed to be sharing a game with Black Panther pretty soon, and I hope that's good, but for right now, this is the best playable version of Captain America. He's the worst character in the game. Captain America is easily the character who struggles the most with battery damage being so prominent. He really doesn't have a way to apply status as quickly, and all of his best moves either can't apply status or it's just not reasonable to hit them. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but the way melee and ranged gear worked in Avengers is that pretty much all your ranged attacks could have a status on them, but only certain melee attacks could. And there was also this stat called Intensity, which affected how much stat damage you dealt, but it was also a complete dump stat that meant nothing. Fact of the matter is that certain attacks were good at applying status, like Hulk's power attacks, and if an attack wasn't good at it, Intensity wasn't gonna help. And since Cap just wasn't that good with battery damage, it meant he had to go down other avenues to reach high damage. Problem was that other characters could use the same avenues Cap had to use, but also have battery damage on top of it. I'm not saying you couldn't make Cap work, but if you took the effort that you had to put into Cap and you put it into, let's say, Hulk, because he's the only top tier I've talked about so far, you would just go so much farther with the Hulk or any other character that was better than Cap. Then you add on the fact that Cap doesn't have great mobility and he's one of two characters that has a hard set limit on how far his ranged attacks could go, and he was hands down the worst character for the raid. There's legitimately a huge chunk of the raid where the only thing a Captain America player could do to help was stand on a button and not die, because you have a limited time to destroy certain objectives and Cap just can't reach them. And it's tragic, man, really, because I loved playing as Captain America, but I knew for a fact if I wanted to do the raid as him, I was going to get carried to an extent. And when it came time to final boss, you wouldn't even need to be told. You'd be heading straight for the back room right off the bat. Just a really unfortunate character to enjoy playing. In a roster where every character was either A tier or S tier, Cap sits in B tier all by his lonely. Jarvis, just go to the next character. You know, if you didn't live in this timeline, you'd assume Iron Man being the poster boy of the MCU means that he has his own big budget single player game. But you'd be wrong, all Iron Man has is a couple movie tie-in games that are kinda and that VR game that looks cool, but it's a VR game. You need to have at least 10 different VR games on your wish list before buying a VR headset is worth it. So all that being said, Iron Man is another character where the best playable version of him is in Avengers. His intrinsic ability is his variety of ranged weapons that all use his intrinsic meter as ammunition. You can aim and fire his repulsors, lasers, and rockets, or you can use them in your melee combos because they serve as both his ranged attacks and his heavy attacks. You refill your intrinsic meter by landing light attacks or landing parries, meaning Iron Man is a very active character, where you're constantly going back and forth between melee combat and shooting. His ultimate heroic is the Hulk Buster, which is a ton of fun to use. It's got the rapid piston punches from the MCU. And of course, the most important part of any playable Iron Man appearance, he has a chunky fucking unibeam. It's got a lot of impact and it has great sound effects. Iron Man easily one of the best represented characters in Avengers. One of those characters whose moveset makes you think that if Crystal Dynamics just made a full-on Iron Man game, it'd probably be hard as fuck. Not only was he one of the best represented characters in the game, he was one of the best characters in the game flat out. And depending on how you gauge a character's value, you could make an argument that he was the best. Even before you take battery damage into account, Iron Man had insane damage, which primarily was thanks to his rockets, which were intended to be the high damage, slow firing option. But there was a trick where if you switched back and forth between repulsors and rockets, you could fire the rockets at a much higher rate. Getting good at this trick was instrumental for maximizing your DPS as Iron Man. But on top of this insane tech that pretty much tripled Iron Man's DPS, he also had his support heroic Arc Overload. Arc Overload instantly overcharges Iron Man and his teammates' intrinsic meters, and when Iron Man's intrinsic meter is overcharged, he has infinite ammo and increased range damage. On top of that, Arc Overload instantly applied the shock status effect to any enemies nearby. Shock is a negatively charged status effect, so Iron Man could get some gear that puts a positive status effect on his rockets, and he could pretty much melt any boss in the game. On top of his insane DPS, Iron Man had a crazy amount of utility. Taking damage in Hulkbuster could knock you out of it early, but unless you were hit by an insta-kill one-shot attack, you couldn't die in Hulkbuster, meaning Iron Man was a character that could pull off some insanely clutch revives. And if you held down the button, you wouldn't instantly hop in the Hulkbuster, you would let your teammates use the armor, which really came in handy during those parts of the raid I mentioned earlier where Cap and one other character just couldn't contribute. If Iron Man donated his Hulkbuster to Cap or that other character, it meant they could actually help with the objective. And speaking of raid objectives, just factually speaking, no one did them better than Iron Man. With his mobility and his ranged attacks, Iron Man could do most of the raid by himself. He just needed people to push buttons and stand on buttons. If you valued raid efficiency over boss damage, you really couldn't argue with Iron Man being the best character in the game. Like, the only thing that really kept people from saying Iron Man was definitively the best character in the game is the fact that there were two characters that were better at killing bosses than him. But I don't want to talk about them yet. I want to talk about a character that was really good and really well done in Avengers and is absolutely bottom tier in Marvel Rivals.
So, what's your superpower?
Kicking.
Oh, right, because none of us can kick. Hey, which one of you guys can kick? Hulk, stop being nice.
Sorry.
Black Widow is a character that more than likely will never get her own single-player game. She's the type of character that, even if a studio put together a document for a Splinter Cell-like stealth action game starring Black Widow, they would take it to Disney and Disney would respond with, you know, that's cool and all, but it won't make infinite money, so get the fuck out of here. It's a shame, but for Black Widow and 2, maybe 3 other characters in the cast, a game like Avengers is the best they were ever gonna get. But for what it's worth, I think Black Widow was represented pretty well in Avengers. Obviously, it's not the ideal genre for the character, but I think Crystal Dynamics did a fine job translating the essence of Black Widow into a moveset. Black Widow was an incredibly versatile Swiss Army knife of a character. Of all the characters, I'd say she probably had the most impactful mastery skills, and it made her incredibly adaptable. You could really build her to do anything. I've been trying to keep the balance talk and the character work talk separated, but you can't really do that for Black Widow because her being this jack of all trades in gameplay is kind of part of her character work. Her intrinsic ability was very true to her character. It's essentially a hit streak where if you land hits without getting hit, you do more damage. Of course, Avengers had a lot of random damage coming your way, so it was very easy to lose this intrinsic ability. In terms of her viability, Widow was absolutely fantastic. She's either the weakest S-tier character or the strongest A-tier character. Widow had built-in status damage out the ass. Outside of her Assault Heroic instantly applying shock and her basic heavy attack having shock on it by default, Widow's power attack had her throwing out a grenade and you could pick one of 3 statuses to apply to it. 2 of them negatively charged, 1 of them positively charged, which means Black Widow and Iron Man were the only 2 characters that had the potential to do battery damage in their base kit. And very similarly to Iron Man, Widow performed extremely well in the raid. I've already said how the raid favored ranged characters, and Black Widow had maybe the 3rd best ranged attacks in the game. But she had better mobility than one of the characters that was better than her, so it was kind of even in terms of raid efficiency. The next character I'm going to talk about has the unfortunate honor of being the best support character in the game. Miss Marvel is, quite frankly, another character that'll probably never get her own single-player game, which is a shame because for a while there, Kamala was probably Marvel's most popular legacy character, but she kinda got jerked around by Disney's whole, man, fuck the mutants, we got the Inhumans. Oh, fuck the Inhumans, we need the mutants. Regardless of that, Kamala is probably the best character in Avengers from a visual standpoint, because her animations are absolutely nutty, and I'd say they're a perfect representation of Kamala's specific form of stretchy powers. Her limbs are constantly stretching, expanding, ballooning in size, moving like rubber. Now, I'm no 3D modeler or animator, but I can't even begin to fathom how you get a character to move like this. The animations are never janky, they're very fluid, and unlike somebody like Mr. FUNKtastic, Kamala's limbs feel like they have to follow the laws of physics. Kamala doesn't just throw punches, she has to literally swing her fist like a flail. She's a lot like Cap in the sense that her animations make her very fun to play. And you can grab an enemy like they're an ice cream cone. I think this is everything you could want out of a playable Kamala Khan. You're doing pretty much everything she does. Unfortunately, Kamala was a lot like Captain America in more ways than just having really good animations and sound effects. She wasn't bad by any means. None of the characters in Avengers were bad, just some were outshined. Kamala's power attacks and signature attacks could apply status really fast. And Kamala could annihilate big enemies that weren't bosses. If an enemy was afflicted with PIM particles, they would shrink. If a big enemy shrunk and Kamala used her ult to get big, she could hold them like an ice cream cone as if they were a normal-sized enemy. Since PIM particles are positive, if she had a negative status effect on her ranged attack, she could give them the squeeze and pretty much despawn them. Really good damage, but it takes a lot of resources. You have to spend your intrinsic meter and your ult for it. And since you couldn't do it to bosses, it meant Kamala had to rely on her very slow ranged attack for battery damage. Honestly, Kamala's ranged attack is the only thing keeping her out of the S tier. It's pretty slow even if you pick the fastest option for it, and it actually has less range than Captain America's shield. Yeah, Kamala is the other character who can't help during the destroy crystals part of the raid I was mentioning, but she could still do more than Captain America in that situation. Kamala's support heroic healing spirit has her do a little cheer, and it did a lot. It instantly revives anybody that's down, it gives your teammates a burst of healing, it gives them some healing over time afterward, and it gives them a defense buff. And then it had specializations that let you have multiple charges of it, and a specialization that let you revive yourself with it. And even if everybody went down, if a Kamala had this specialization selected, it meant the game wouldn't instantly kick you back to checkpoint, so she had insane clutch potential. And then eventually Kamala got an exotic piece of gear that added a huge damage buff to Healing Spirit on top of all the other benefits it provided. So even if Kamala was outshined in terms of pure damage and efficiency, she brought so much utility to the team that she was still a very good character. Speaking of really good characters, let's hop over to the last base roster hero.
I can't move! What's going on?
You were foolish to take on the essence of Mjolnir, mortal. The hammer's power is not yours to control. It is mine.
The mighty Thor, another character that has been made incredibly popular by the MCU, but has still only had mediocre tie-in movie games. With Thor, it's a little bit more understandable than Iron Man, because I don't think Thor was anybody's favorite character until his third movie. Then after his third movie, he did a bunch of cool shit in Infinity War, and he played Fortnite in Endgame. So I don't know if there was really a solid idea of how people wanted Thor to play if he got his own game, but I think Avengers knocked it out of the park. In terms of combat design, I think Thor is probably the coolest character in the game, because Thor's combat was designed by the same guy that designed the combat for God of War 2018. If you aren't familiar with that game, Kratos can throw and recall his Leviathan axe very similarly to how Mjolnir works in Marvel. Whenever the axe is away from him, Kratos switches to a brawling fighting style, and Thor in Marvel's Avengers is very much the same. His entire moveset is based around controlling Mjolnir. Whenever you aim and throw Mjolnir away, you have to recall it by heavy attacking, re-aiming, or casting a heroic. While Thor is unarmed, it gives him access to a new light combo string, and it changes how his intrinsic ability works. When you tap the intrinsic ability button, it summons lightning to Thor and the hammer. So you can throw the hammer on the ground and create an area of lightning damage with your intrinsic ability. Or you can be a dick and pin an enemy down and just repeatedly strike them with lightning. And if somebody tries to hit you while you're unarmed, you can dodge, recall the hammer, and have it hit them on its way back to you. It's a moveset entirely designed around where the hammer is at any given time, where you're just constantly going from swinging Mjolnir, throwing hands, calling Mjolnir back to you. It's a fantastic moveset that captures the spirit of the character, but sadly it's not what makes Thor one of the top 2 characters in the game. I never really liked playing Thor personally because the fun parts of him were not the strong parts of him. What made Thor strong was that he had the highest base Valor stat in the game. Valor was the stat that increased the effectiveness of your heroic abilities. So it was really easy to get an extremely high Valor stat as Thor, and on top of that, all of his heroics were insanely good. His support heroic, Warrior's Fury, had a very short base duration, but it boosted his damage and his teammates' damage by a lot. Thor's assault heroic, God Blast, was a huge burst of shock damage. Combine that with the fact that Thor's signature attack where he spins the hammer is one of the best moves in the game for applying status, and it meant Thor could do insane battery damage. Because one of God Blast's specializations is that you could hold 3 charges for it. Now you do lose a tiny amount of damage when you select that specialization that gives you 3 charges, but there was also an exploit where Thor could have 3 charges with none of the downsides of that specialization. And then Thor's ultimate where he calls down the Bifrost was just a big ass burst of damage that he could put other statuses on. And again, since he has the highest Valor stat in the game and you can stack more Valor on him through gear, it was very easy to build Thor to one-shot bosses. Listen, I mained Hulk. I'm not going to deny that Hulk was a strong character, was a top tier character, but Thor was so strong I never liked this dude because it felt like cheating. I will say though, Thor being so insanely overpowered fits. Like that's what Thor does in the Avengers. He shows up and he one-shots. So now I can look at it and say, well, being overpowered is part of feeling like Thor. But back in the day, man, playing as Captain America and playing with my buddy that main Thor, seeing what Thor could do versus seeing what Cap could do, I'd be sitting there like, these two characters are in the same game. The only reason I wouldn't say Thor is definitively the #1 character is for 2 reasons. Number 1 is that this next character could actually compete with Thor in terms of damage, and number 2, it's extremely funny to say this guy's the strongest character in the game. Hawkeye's role, his niche in the Avengers, has always been to be the only normal guy on the team. A regular man that keeps up with gods, monsters, and legendary soldiers with nothing but a bow and arrow, circus tricks, and tenacity. Also a sword because he spent some time as a Ronin named Ronin. Hawkeye is a character who was created to be underestimated. Marvel's Avengers captures this idea by giving Hawkeye a moveset where he has a million tricks up his sleeve. Or more accurately, in his quiver. His power attack combo is actually called Bag of Tricks, where he would just shoot several different trick arrows in a row. And all of his heroic abilities were trick arrows as well, though admittedly I always thought they were a little lazy. Like his support heroic is called Healing Arrow, where he shoots the ground and makes a circle of healing. I mean, I can't deny that he fired an arrow to do it, but he just made a circle of healing. I always thought this ability would have been cooler if you shot your teammates to heal them. His assault heroic was kind of just area of effect status damage. Like, yeah, he is shooting arrows, but a ton of different characters could have had this same skill. I think Hawkeye makes up for those 2 abilities being kind of boring by having one of the most fitting intrinsic abilities in the game. First things first, his parry, where he dodges the attack and shoots an arrow from close range, is cool as hell. And I really like the light attack follow-up where he stabs the enemy with an arrow. Hawkeye's main intrinsic ability is called Archer's Instinct, and all it is while you're holding the button down, Hawkeye will automatically dodge any attack that could be blocked. Which might sound kind of boring, but to me it perfectly encapsulates Hawkeye's nature as just a normal guy. He can't tank the hit like Hulk or Thor, and he doesn't have a shield or any armor, he has to dodge it. But some nobody, if he can only auto-dodge attacks that could be blocked, doesn't that mean functionally this is just a block like Captain America's? Functionally, sure, but the theming of it goes a long way in capturing what makes Hawkeye so cool. And that's the fact Hawkeye does so much despite being the easiest Avenger to kill from a biological standpoint at least. Then you have the second part of his intrinsic, which is the overcharge, and it's the coolest one in the game. When you overcharge Hawkeye's intrinsic meter, he just gets aimbot. He'll automatically target enemy weak points. Plus, Hawkeye and Kate both have this mechanic where if you let the arrow go at a certain point in the charging, it'll do bonus damage. And these specially timed arrows get a stacking damage buff that increases if you land them consecutively. These two mechanics coming together is when you really start feeling like Hawkeye. Now, as far as Hawkeye's strength in-game goes, he defies all logic to be one of the top two. And that is primarily because of one specific type of trick arrow that Hawkeye can fire. The first and last attack of his Bag of Tricks combo I mentioned earlier, as well as his air power attack, fires off a split shot arrow. The split shot arrow is the attack you've probably seen in this gameplay where Hawkeye fires an arrow that splits into a ton of projectiles that automatically track. And if all of those projectiles hit the same target, it would do comparable damage to Thor's God Blast. And Hawkeye had an exotic that would add more projectiles to split shot arrow. And since it's a power attack, it means split shot arrow can have status damage on it, and that means it can do battery damage. So you combine the insane strength of split shot arrow with the fact that one of Hawkeye's ultimate specializations instantly applied shock to every enemy in the room, and suddenly the normalest, least superpowered individual on the team is one of the strongest, if not the strongest character in the game. Which is actually pretty funny, man. Hawkeye is so strong, what if there was a second Hawkeye? Kate Bishop is a tough one to talk about because she's the only character in Avengers whose moveset isn't really an adaptation of her character. Because the ideal Kate Bishop gameplay experience is not too different from the ideal Clint Barton gameplay experience. They're both Hawkeye after all, but in Marvel's Avengers, these two have completely different playstyles. Stolen aim tech gives Kate Bishop the ability to harness quantum energy, which she primarily uses for short-range teleportation, but also has a few attacks using it. One thing I really enjoy about Kate Bishop in Marvel's Avengers is that you can tell she was trained by Hawkeye. People used to say that Hawkeye was an echo character of Kate, but that's just really not the case. There are clearly shared ideas in both of their movesets, but I think the only animation they actually share is when they're aiming and firing the bow. Other than that, their attacks have unique animations and functions. I think it was pretty commendable of Crystal Dynamics to create two characters with a lot of similar ideas in their movesets, but they're still almost entirely unique from one another. And you know, even though the teleporting around really isn't a Kate Bishop thing, it does make her one of the most fun characters in the game. Because who doesn't like crazy mobility? Especially when you alt or overcharge her intrinsic meter and get to do it infinitely. And it really worked in her favor because the best way to play Kate Bishop was to get right up close to an enemy and try and hit them with as many arrows of your spread shot as you could. You pretty much played Kate like the scout from TF2, use your mobility to get in and meat shot. And obviously if these meat shots were doing battery damage, Kate could actually do some very respectable DPS. Overall, Kate was a strong and fun character, but I don't really have too much to say about her. A Kate Bishop fan would probably be happy that she was even included, but I don't know if they'd be happy with the way she plays. I was very happy with the way the next character played though. Black Panther has the meaningless honor of being some nobody's second favorite character in the game. Because on top of having the most stylish melee moveset in the roster, he also had one of the most fun gameplay loops. All while having a moveset that really captured pretty much everything you could want out of a playable Black Panther. The mysticism, the advanced technology of Wakanda, and the primal nature of his fighting style. The advanced tech of Wakanda best comes through in his support heroic and his intrinsic ability, Panther's Cowl. How Panther's Cowl works is while you're holding down the button, you will automatically block and absorb the kinetic energy of any attack that can be blocked or parried. Then you can use that stored kinetic energy to enhance a ton of Black Panther's regular attacks, turning them into these multi-hitting, really cool looking versions. Or you could completely fill the meter and release all the kinetic energy at once in an explosion that gave you a damage buff for a limited time. Trying to chain these kinetic bursts together and keep the damage buff up permanently is why I say Black Panther had one of the most fun gameplay loops. Panther's support heroic was the Kimoyo beads, which were these little drones he could throw out to either stun enemies or heal allies. The primal nature of the Black Panther's fighting style really shines through in his assault heroic, his ranged attacks, and obviously his melee moveset. Despite the technology at his disposal, Black Panther's ranged options are the traditional old-fashioned weaponry, throwing knives and spears. What I really like about Panther's ranged options from a design standpoint is that they're both designed to work in tandem with his melee moveset. His throwing daggers apply a debuff that makes enemies take more melee damage, and his vibranium spear does vibranium damage when you have a full intrinsic meter, which means if you want to make the most out of either of his ranged options, you gotta get up close and personal. And there's really nothing more personal than pouncing on an enemy to pin them down and tear into them. The mysticism in Panther's kit comes from his ultimate Bass Chosen, where the Panther goddess herself shows up to give T'Challa an assist and also give him a damage buff and damage reduction. Just an absolutely terrific character from a design standpoint, one of those characters that makes me think if Crystal Dynamics got to just make a single player Black Panther game, that would have been cool as shit. Because the fact they managed to dip their toes into every facet of Black Panther in his moveset makes me really want to see what they could have done if they expanded on just this character. But you know, it is what it is. At the very least, Black Panther gets to be like the coolest character in the game and pretty strong. The healing version of Black Panther's Kimoyo beads was one of the best support heroics in the game. It had really good healing, and on top of that, it had a specialization that while the Kimoyo beads were out, they would automatically destroy projectiles that were coming for your teammates. The best characters in Avengers were ones that could instantly apply a status effect, and Black Panther could do that with his assault heroic, because like I mentioned, at full intrinsic meter, his vibranium spear would instantly apply the vibranium status effect. One of the specializations for his ultimate heroic gave him the ability to revive his teammates with it and revive himself with it, which is one of the things that makes Kamala such a good character. Speaking of Kamala, remember how I mentioned she had tech to pretty much instantly kill any enemy in the game that wasn't a boss? Panther could do something very similar for way less resources. Since his pounce was a power attack, it meant that any attack you did while you had the enemy pinned down would apply whatever status you had on your power attacks. And Panther could pounce any enemy in the game except for bosses. Combine that with the fact Panther had a way to instantly apply a status effect, and he killed Adaptoids, Exos, and Big Spiders very easily. So all in all, Panther was a character that was really good at everything, but unfortunately he's not one of the top tiers because he wasn't the best at anything. A very typical jack-of-all-trades character. Now before I get to the last character I'm going to talk about today, I should at least mention the character I don't want to talk about, and that's the Mighty Thor, aka Jane Foster. She plays pretty much identically to Thor except for the fact she has her own ultimate. I don't find her that interesting. She's very clearly a case of the higher ups coming in and say, hey, synergize with the MCU, put Jane Foster in real quick. Especially because like her lore reason for being included is that she was from another timeline and she just got dumped into the game's timeline. Anyway, the last character I'm going to talk about was the very last character to be added to the game. And he's definitely my least played character because when the final update for the game came out, I was kind of like, man, fucking whatever. But you know, I've actually been enjoying him since I came back to the game again.
Say that again?
The Winter Soldier, James Buchanan, Bucky in quotes, Barnes. He's an interesting one because he's clearly unfinished. He recycles a lot of ideas from other characters and he just uses Captain America's light and heavy attack combo animations. His support heroic Soldier Tech nonsense has him go invisible like Black Widows, and his assault heroic Airstrike has him do damage in an AoE. His intrinsic ability is almost identical to Black Panther's. Block attacks with Bucky's metal arm to build up meter, and then you can spend that meter on enhanced versions of your attacks, or you can expend all the meter at once in an explosion that gives Bucky a defense buff instead of a damage buff. I will admit the intrinsic ability explosion can be made to do more interesting things through the mastery skills. I primarily use the one that makes enemies marked for assassination. I'll explain what that does later. Bucky's ranged option is his rifle that has burst firing, full auto, an underbarrel shotgun, and an underbarrel grenade launcher. The Avengers may have succeeded in taking down AIM, but if the ATF hears about this, they're fucked. Elements of Bucky's rifle are definitely recognizable as coming from other characters. His full auto mode is pretty much identical to Black Widow's full auto pistols, and the underbarrel grenade launcher is functionally the same as the explosive arrows from both the Hawkeyes. I give the rifle a pass though, because you can say it's nothing but reused concepts, but all you're really saying is, hey, that gun works like another gun. Where Bucky starts getting unique is in his signature attacks, his power attacks, and his intrinsic attacks. Bucky's signature attack combo has him do an uppercut with his metal arm, then a downercut with his metal arm, then a series of ground pounds with, you guessed it, his metal arm. His power attack has him using all of the most illegal elements of his rifle in one combo. A blast from the underbarrel shotgun, a hail of bullets from the full auto mode, and finishing it off with a classic noob tube. As far as his intrinsic attacks go, Bucky has entirely unique follow-up attacks after a parry, and he can use his intrinsic meter to add a knife slash to his sprinting and dodging light attacks, or turn his sprinting and dodging heavy attacks into a ground pound or a shotgun blast respectively. Now the absolute best part of Bucky's kit thematically is his ultimate. The idea of it is very similar to Captain America's ult, where they both do a ground pound and then get an enhanced light attack combo as well as bonus damage. But where Captain America just gets a stronger version of his regular light attack combo, Bucky gets a whole new combo involving his knife. He also has a unique animation for going into it where he seems to be losing control, and any enemy that is hit by Bucky's version of the ground pound is immediately marked for assassination, which means that Bucky can hit them with a takedown without having to stun them first. And I would honestly say there's no ultimate more appropriate for the Winter Soldier than losing control of yourself and going on a killing spree. But aside from that, I really like that Bucky's ultimate is a dark reflection of Captain America's. Cap does good damage in his ult, but the greatest thing about it is that it increases his survivability, whereas Winter Soldier's ultimate increases his lethality. Overall, upon revisiting the Winter Soldier and actually putting some time into him, I'd have to say he's probably the most commendable character design. It's clear that Crystal Dynamics did not have the time or resources that they did for the first 10 characters, but I'd still say they did a pretty good job capturing a playable Winter Soldier. Now, I can't tell you for certain whether or not he was a strong character, because I can't take him into the endgame content. If I ask somebody to play Marvel's Avengers with me in 2025, they're going to throw me in Broadmoor. But I imagine he's really strong because he's got all the strengths of Captain America with a really good ranged option and a piece of gear that would have changed the game for Cap. See, most characters can only get gear that adds status effects to certain attacks, but Bucky could get gear that added status effects to all of his knife attacks. Combine that with the fact he has a way to instantly apply the shock status effect, and it means he could do battery damage off of every hit in his ultimate melee combo. And honestly, man, if Cap could do that, he would have been an S tier character. But that's every single character in Marvel's Avengers, and I hope you can understand now why I wanted this game to succeed. Because more than anything, I saw Avengers as the one and only opportunity that some Marvel characters would ever get to have a cool playable appearance. Here's a list of heroes that were data mined for Marvel's Avengers, meaning there was either some consideration on adding them or there was some work put into them. We know for a fact that She-Hulk at least had her voice lines recorded. And this is the unfortunate part of Marvel's Avengers, is that these superhero games don't get made based on somebody having a good idea for the character, they get made based off name recognition. Why do you think Insomniac is making a Wolverine game despite the fact that Wolverine as a character doesn't mesh well with their style of gameplay design at all? It's because if Disney is gonna pay you to make a game out of one of their IPs, they're gonna want guaranteed big profits. And since most producers don't understand the video game industry very well, that means one of two things. AAA games are free-to-play games with very heavy monetization. No AA Scarlet Witch games coming out anytime soon. And you might say, some nobody, isn't it a bit odd to lament the commercialization of these superhero games while advocating for a game that was clearly just chasing the Destiny 2 payday? Instead of wishing Avengers had succeeded, shouldn't you be wishing for all these heroes to get their own single-player games? My friend, there's wishing things had played out differently and wishing you lived in a different world. Because in the world we're living in, they ain't making a fucking Ant-Man game. If Iron Man ain't got a good single-player game yet, you think they're giving one to Vision? That ain't the world we live in, brother. The world we live in, if I want to play as Doctor Strange, I gotta play fucking Overwatch. Quick sidebar. Marvel Rivals is fun, and I'm actually impressed at how well they managed to adapt certain characters' movesets into a hero shooter, but we gotta admit something. We gotta admit we fell for it again. We let good character designs trick us into playing Overwatch twice. Who's gonna be the first guy to say that like they never liked the game, they always hated it, always thought it was trash, the only good thing to come out of it was Squirrel Girl porn? Because I know for a fact one of you were like one ranked loss away from putting that tweet out. Speaking of character designs, let me segue into talking about one of Avengers' many flaws. Some people were clowning on Avengers 4 not too long ago was its lack of an art style, the fact that it went for a realistic look instead of a comic book art style like Marvel Rivals. And yeah, an art style will beat realism any day of the week. But I will say the biggest problem with a lot of Avengers designs is that they went the MCU route of being afraid of color. You look at Captain America's default armor and it looks just like that, default armor, a SWAT guy with a star on his chest, he barely has any red. Now here is that same outfit with more vibrant colors that immediately make it a better design. You could still say the armor's too bulky, but at least there's some red and white and not all blue. Very similar deal with the Hulk, he's a very muted shade of green and he's just wearing regular jeans. He doesn't pop out despite being 10 feet tall, he looks like just a dude. Then you go over to this recolor of the same look and that's the Hulk. He's called Big Green and he's just not green enough outside of this skin. Thor 2, his default look is fine, it's alright, add some color to it and it's instantly a better design. Listen, there were some definitive misses like Hawkeye's default look being absolutely awful, but there were some solid looks in Avengers. This is a really good classic Spider-Man, and people were clowning on Black Panther the hardest for his unmasked skins, which I'll admit weren't great, but otherwise Black Panther had the best skins in the game. I read some article the other day where somebody said that Avengers' biggest issue was its character designs, and I'm just saying no it was not. Avengers didn't die because the Hulk wasn't green enough. There are all these people online that talk about what went wrong with Avengers, why did Avengers die, and you listen to them talk and it's very clearly coming from an outsider looking in. It's almost never coming from a guy that was in the shit. And I hate to pull rank, but I was there. I was reloading checkpoint every time a game-breaking bug happened. I was dismantling gear one piece at a time. I was in the PlayStation party in the wee hours of the night just talking with my buddy who was really into the game as well, just talking about what needed to change, what needed to happen. One of those talks where you finish playing the game and you're meant to get off like 2 hours ago, but you just keep talking. And all we were talking about was the state of Avengers. And I said to him, you know something, Lil B based God? I really want this game to turn it around, but I know for a fact that it won't. And that's because the discovery I made in those late night chats is that the real reason this game failed is that from the very beginning there was no chance it could ever succeed.
From where you're kneeling must seem like an 18-karat run of bad luck. Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
So Crystal Dynamics goes to Square Enix and they pitch a single-player Avengers game, where you would switch around and play as all the different members of the Avengers one at a time. And according to the Wikipedia article for the game, Crystal Dynamics came to the conclusion that, single player doesn't really give you the Avengers experience, we should make it a multiplayer game. Which I can buy Crystal Dynamics making that decision, but I don't buy them deciding to make it a live service looter shooter. It's a little too ambitious for a single-player studio in my eyes. But they get to work on the game, the set to be released May 2020. And then COVID hit and the game got delayed by 4 months. So we're already off to a bad start. We're being published by Square Enix and our name isn't Tatsuya Nomura. So we're not getting much leeway. And now there's a plague, which means everybody's working on the game from home, and critical time that would be spent doing QA and making sure the game functions on release is hampered. Using your home internet to upload and download entire builds of a game is not a fast process. So the game comes out and it is riddled with bugs. It is buggier than that clown from One Piece whose name I can't remember. And the combination of no QA and a single player studio developing a multiplayer game for the first time means the servers ain't good either. The game is so rough on launch that Cloning Labs and Kate Bishop, both of which were supposed to come out like a month after the game released, had to get pushed back. The first 3 months of the game's life is spent almost entirely on trying to fix bugs while working from home. Underneath all these issues caused by unfortunate world events is the nagging issue that Crystal Dynamics has never made a game like this before. The gear system in Avengers at launch was absolutely dreadful. Every piece of gear you got had to be upgraded multiple times. The higher the rarity, the more you had to upgrade it. You had to upgrade it because that's how you got gear that was a base higher level than the gear you already had. So you dumped resources into gear you didn't care about to get higher tiered gear that you didn't care about because gear at launch was fucking boring. The perks on the gear were pretty uninteresting and not character specific, and the numbers attached to the perks were so low all you really cared about with gear is what stats it had. And even exotic gear was boring at first. Now here's the thing, gear did eventually get better and get more interesting, but unfortunately there was a big oversight when it came to exotic gear. You see, in Destiny you can equip one exotic weapon and one exotic piece of armor, meaning that the exotics in Destiny have way more impact, but the rest of your kit is going to be lower rarity gear. And that means any gear that you get below exotic is always going to have a use, meaning any content you play has a chance of giving you a worthwhile piece of gear. In Avengers, you could have an exotic in every slot, and exotics would have better stats and typically better perks than gear below exotic. What that means is you eventually get to a point where any gear below exotic doesn't matter, and therefore any content that doesn't give you an exotic isn't worth playing. Now with every live service game, you will eventually hit a point where you're just sitting around waiting for new content to come out, and this is where more issues arose. Content development being slow couldn't really be helped, what with the worldwide plague going on at the time, but it really didn't help that Crystal Dynamics just couldn't stop making single player content for their live service multiplayer game. Taking Aim, Future Imperfect, and War for Wakanda were all big content drops that didn't add anything for the game's multiplayer side. The only thing of value that came out of them was adding on to the game's story. Like I mentioned earlier, the game didn't get its first piece of endgame content until 9 months after release. But you know, over time, Crystal Dynamics was getting better at making a multiplayer game. Outside of COVID, a lot of the game's first year growing pains had to do with the fact that the team behind the game got restructured. Pretty much right after the game's launch, Crystal Dynamics brought in a bunch of new people who understood multiplayer games a bit better. Which is how Cloning Labs went from releasing 2 weeks after launch to being the game's final update. The new team had to spend the first year pretty much entirely reworking a lot of the game's systems. One of the guys they brought in as part of this initiative was Brian Wagner, the dude behind Marvel Heroes Omega. It was an MMO developed by Gazillion Studios that a lot of people really liked. It was fairly popular, but unfortunately the CEO of Gazillion just couldn't stop being silly. So Disney cut ties with the studio and shut the game down. But people were really hopeful for Brian Wagner becoming the new systems designer for Avengers. And honestly, if he was there from the start, who knows how things could have turned out. I mentioned earlier I was very hopeful for the game after the raid came out. It was a fantastic piece of content, we had a good team behind it, a lot of the most annoying systems had been reworked. By the time the raid came out, Avengers had shaped up a lot. But this is where being published by Square Enix rears its ugly head. Because here's the thing that publishers don't seem to really understand. All these publishers that chase the Destiny payday, that want the money that Destiny brings in. They don't understand that at launch, Destiny 1 fucking sucked. At launch, there wasn't shit to do in it. Most Destiny players will tell you they didn't really fuck with the game until a full year after its release when The Taken King came out. Now, I'm not sure exactly why Activision trusted Bungie to be able to turn things around. I haven't the faintest idea why they would invest so much in Bungie. But they did, and here we are 10 years later and the Destiny brand is still kicking. So here we have Avengers at the end of 2021 in a pretty good spot. In a spot where they could make that year 2 comeback. And Square Enix said, fuck that, we got other live service games. Square Enix published Outriders in 2021 and Babylon's Fall in 2022. Despite the 2-year head start, Avengers actually managed to outlive Babylon's Fall, and Square Enix fucked over the developers of Outriders heavy. So Avengers 2022 was pretty terrible. There was hardly any content released because it's clear the budget was slashed and half the team was cut up and put onto other projects. Since all the actual content in Avengers was free and the only monetization it had was cosmetics, I imagine Square Enix just didn't give a shit about getting content out. Ultimately, Square Enix sold Crystal Dynamics and Avengers to Embracer Group. And honestly, when they sold it to Embracer Group, I got a little bit of hope, because you know what, they couldn't be any worse than Square Enix. After being sold to Embracer Group, the lead system designer of Avengers, Brian Wagner, who was originally supposed to be the hero, may have put the final nail in the game's coffin. According to Wagner in an interview with Paul Tassi of Forbes, there were plans for 2023 content for Avengers. Unfortunately, Brian Wagner was just a little bit too active on Twitter. All the hate the game would get on the platform clearly got to him, so he would go on there and he'd pick fights. My friend that I've been mentioning throughout this video was actually mutuals with Brian at one point because my friend created a bit of content for Avengers. And my friend was very positive on his socials about Avengers, but he made a complaint about the game one time and Brian Wagner blocked him. Ultimately, if you draw attention to yourself on Twitter, people are gonna look through your profile and find something to hold against you. And Brian Wagner got in big trouble for some old problematic tweets. And it's kind of funny looking back on it, because all this happened only like 2 years ago. If you look at these old tweets and then go on Twitter now, this won't even crack top 50 worst things somebody says on there with their full name and face attached. But it wasn't long after this controversy that Avengers officially announced it'd be shutting down. I can't say for certain whether or not Wagner's tweets were the straw that broke the camel's back, but I can say for certain that this is all Square Enix's fault. Yeah, the game came out at an inopportune time. Yeah, Crystal Dynamics really didn't know how to make a looter shooter. But Square Enix got their hands on the biggest IP on the planet at the time and immediately jumped straight to a live service multiplayer game to chase the highest profit possible, while publishing several other live service multiplayer games and not intending to support any of them post-launch. And as an added bonus, screwing over the legitimately fantastic Guardians of the Galaxy game by Eidos Montreal. But some nobody, if a game isn't profitable, why should the publisher have to continue supporting it? If you have a problem with supporting a game post-launch, why publish a game in the genre that requires you to support it post-launch? You could have just had Crystal Dynamics make an Iron Man game and that would have made you a lot of money. Honestly, I don't think Avengers should have ever existed, but since it did exist, I wish it would have been treated better. Because I think Crystal Dynamics tried their damnedest to make this thing work. It's never the developers that kill these live service games. It is always management. You look at Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. The founders of Rocksteady, Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill, did not want to make a Suicide Squad game. But then they decided, fuck it, let's do it. Warner Brothers has wanted a Suicide Squad game since at least 2013. Hill and Walker come up with the worst fucking idea possible for a Suicide Squad game, that being killing the Justice League. And then they seemingly sabotage the project at every step of the way. They flip shit around in the script constantly. They're the ones who wanted to make it a shooter when Rocksteady is known for its melee combat. They came up with the idea of giving all the characters cars, and the developers were like, but we already designed fun, unique movement for all of them. There's reports of new hires coming in and being like, why the fuck are we making a live service game? There's reports of devs being in the office questioning, what the fuck are we doing? And then Hill and Walker leave Rocksteady to go start a new studio. As an outsider looking in, to me that seems like they sabotaged the game on purpose to spite their bosses at WB Games, but the only people who really suffered from it were the developers. You know what? You look at Destiny, the king of this genre, the thing that all of these other games are trying to emulate. After 10 years on top, we are now seeing the downfall of Destiny. We're starting to see the beginning of the end for Destiny. And you want to know why? Because the CEO of Bungie decided he deserved a car collection more than the developers deserve jobs. I've gotten off track. What I'm trying to say is Avengers was a game that was doomed from the start. But it's also a game that could have been truly incredible if just one or two things was different about it. If it came out a few years later, if it wasn't published by Square Enix, if Crystal Dynamics was better equipped from the start, if Brian Wagner didn't make those tweets. Who knows? The alternate timelines are going crazy with this game. I hear they just added Wolverine. But you know, at the end of the day, it is just a game. There is a specific reason I'm getting so fired up about this one. My friend that I've been mentioning throughout this video that I used to play Avengers with and talk about Avengers with, and obviously I knew him well before Avengers came out. I've known him for a very long time. Late last year, he was cut down in the prime of his life. Oh, he's not dead. He's getting married. No, but in all seriousness, ladies and gentlemen, I really do wish the happy couple the best. He's a great dude. She seems great. They're fantastic. Really, they're the best. So, toast, cheers, mazel tov, whatever you do, we're celebrating them tonight. And you know, while no one's looking, I think I'm gonna go over there and hit that cake. Nah, I'm just pulling your leg.